I I think about the stages, there's steps to trauma healing, and we'll hear about this in slightly different ways. So there's some variation out there, but I'm going to list off four and then break down the last one. And then I'm going to connect it to me personally. So again, give that like more, it's not tangible, but that more like tangible esque, a connection with it. So when we think about trauma healing, we have the initial acknowledgement, which makes sense. We have to actually know, like, acknowledge, okay, yes, I have experienced something that should not have happened. I had an experience that should not have happened to me, and I felt unsafe. I felt stuck, and this has now changed me. Trauma is a lot about the after effects, how it continues to impact our life, even more so ultimately than the event itself. Of course, you can't have one without the other, but it becomes a lot more about how it changes us moving forward. And that has systems, changes to our nervous system. It has changes to how we're able to trust and engage with others. And we can impact absolutely every aspect of our lives. And spiritual abuse is known to do that, to impact every aspect of our lives. So that acknowledgement is really important before we would step into having a sense of safety and stabilization. So I'm feeling unsafe. I'm feeling like the ground's been pulled out from under me. How do I now reestablish a feeling of safety, and how do I start to stabilize? And one aspect of that, to give an example, could be okay, for me to feel safe, I'm not going to walk into a church anytime soon. So that's a common example of what that can look like. To be like, okay, I'm removing that for the time being because I don't feel safe, and I have more of a sense of safety if I don't. So that could be sort of what that looks like. And then we move into the area of processing. So then we're starting, and all of this kind of overlaps with one another. And it's not like 100% linear, like, okay, I've stopped this, or I've did this and now I stopped and now I'm moving to the next. But processing is going to include really thinking back over what has happened, and not only that acknowledgement, but seeking a sense of understanding of like, what was that? Acknowledging that it was wrong. I have a lot of conversations with spiritual abuse survivors where there wasn't really this understanding of like exactly what was wrong and why it was wrong, especially if they're looking for like biblical backing and scripture's been twisted for them. It's like, well, is this actually wrong? And so going back through and making sense of all of that and being able to understand what was wrong and why it was wrong, what it should have looked like again, and why. And oftentimes using scripture for that for someone who is still desiring the Christian worldview aspect of the conversation. So that processing part, there's also the emotional processing that's going to go along with that intellectual side. And I regularly tell people cognitively, we're probably going to make it to a point before we will emotionally. Emotionally, we're going to take longer to feel the things that we're feeling and move along in that healing journey. And that's going to connect with this remembrance and grieving step. Grieving is a journey, and it is oftentimes overlooked when we talk about trauma, particularly when we're talking about spiritual abuse. Again, to hone it in more, we've experienced a lot of different kinds of losses, losses like worldview, losses like actual people, loss of a sense of community, loss of confidence in knowing who God is and what my relationship with Him is like, confidence in my ability to read scripture, loss of just day to day rhythms or weekly rhythms or annual calendar rhythms. I mean, there's just so much that gets messed with. And so when we're looking at grieving, we have 7 steps there. I'm just going to rattle these off for everyone. One is shock or disbelief. So this can be sort of that surreal feeling, not necessarily actual dissociation, but this like, how is this really happening feeling? And then denial, which is ignoring or suppressing feelings of loss, like saying I'm fine when I'm not fine, which depending on who I'm talking to, I might say that as a boundary and it could be a healthy response. But if I'm really doing it within myself, telling myself I'm fine when I'm not, that can be ultimately unhelpful. And then anger, which is not universal, but it can and does come up towards those involved and even towards oneself as well. Like I could feel angry with myself. I can feel angry with others. I feel angry towards God. Bargaining, which is making a deal of some kind. So typically this is with God or with the individual's higher power belief. And this is usually done when there's still a possibility of change in outcome. But I can definitely say that bargaining came up in my story too when I was looking at stepping back into an organization where I'm like, okay, like if I go do this, like, can you not do this? Like I talk about when I was going to walk into a church for the first time, like an actual church building. And I'm like, I'm genuinely trying to seek you, Lord. So like, can we have an agreement that you're not going to smite me when I walk in? Which might sound laughable and absurd, but like I really thought that that could happen because that's what I had been taught since I was little. So that could be what bargaining looks like as well. And then guilt, which is tied with this sense of regret, which doesn't necessarily mean that like I wish that I had made different decisions, but it could just be that I wish different decisions had been made in general, or different actions had been taken, or different words had been said. And then depression, that's those feelings of profound sadness, like whether it's in the clinical sense of like meeting all the requirements for a diagnosis or not. It could, maybe it's clinical depression, maybe it's just like this strongly depressed feeling. And then acceptance and hope. And so this is the genuine feeling that though life may not look the same again, in fact, it probably won't. There's more life to live and there's going to be more goodness in it. These are not, like you mentioned, Kat, these are not like linear, these grief stages. Like they get all mixed up and jumbled around. Someone may not experience every single one, and they will likely revisit them. And even acceptance and hope, as much as that sounds like it's a final landing place, I have hit the place of acceptance and hope. And then I've left it again and I've come back to it and I've left it and come back to it. And so that's not necessarily like, oh, I've hit it. I'm never going to step, off
I'm
that mark
done.
again. Yeah, exactly. That's not
Yeah.
necessarily the case. So all of this, as you're probably hearing, I mean, there's a lot that goes into moving forward from a trauma. And while all of this is happening, for me personally, for a while there, I had a real struggle with what's called intent of purpose. I had a really difficult time like gathering up energy to do work, to use like some physics language. I didn't have the ability to do that. Like I was so thrown by everything and overwhelmed by everything and struggling so much that so unlike me, I mean, I just like didn't show up for work and lost a job. I was just really flaky. Is a word that would have been used about me. Like just I was not dependable. And I really struggled through that. And it had a lot to do, I mean, it had everything to do with the multiple traumas I had experienced, especially in such short succession, and not even knowing what any of that was. And so while I was going through that process, relationships were really hard. Um, they didn't have the depth, they didn't have the quality. I wasn't able to like really build and grow them. And there's still relationships where I look back on today and I just regret it because they were really beautiful people. And it wasn't that I was mean to people or that I was anything like that. It was just I didn't really show up. Like I couldn't be counted on because on any given day, I didn't know if I was really going to be able to get out of bed and function like a normal human being or not. So that was really difficult. And then I've continued as well while processing trauma, very successful in previous jobs, and actually had a therapist probably, gosh, this might have been like 7, 8 years ago when I was trying to work through some dissociative stuff that I was dealing with still. And I remember him saying like, you're so high function, like nobody would know that you're struggling with anything. Like you could literally just continue the rest of your life. Like you don't have to take this on unless you choose to. And it was a kindness of his because he knows that it can be a really difficult thing to turn toward. And so he's just kind of looking for like, what's your motivator? Because this is going to need a motivator to go through. And I just see like this difference between how I was like in my 20s. And I don't think it's necessarily an age thing. I think it's where I was at in the process that I was able to get up and do all of the things, but I still had this stuff going on inside. So I share that because any of you who are watching this, you might find that you more so lean in one direction or the other. They both can mean that you're healing from trauma though. Like it doesn't necessarily look like I can't function. You could be incredibly functioning. Like you could be distracting like none other and knocking it out of the park. And in reality, inside you're very disconnected or you're falling apart. So it can on the exterior look different. And so Kat, I kind of wonder because, and I don't want to so much target the two interactions you've had like specifically, but even maybe from what you've seen from the trafficking world, people can be walking around looking fine and acting fine. And we can accidentally, because of that, assume that they're more fine than they are. And so that's a caution I have for those who are wanting to come alongside someone is even though they're not obviously to you falling to pieces, it doesn't mean that it's not taking incredible courage and strength for them not to be falling to pieces.